What is the mission that you're on?
My mission is to help people appreciate that much of chronic disease, we look at them as these siloed, individual, distinct disorders with totally distinct origins, and yet much of them share a common core. It's as if they're branches growing from the same tree. And the conventional clinical care will look at these branches and give someone a prescription for a medication, which is only going to prune the branch back a little bit, never actually solving the problem. It can just grow right back. And so we can look at most of these chronic diseases that are killing us globally and then say, okay, there are in fact some simple lifestyle changes that can be implemented that will help reduce the risk of not only one or two, but all of the top killers, from things like Alzheimer's disease to heart disease to type 2 diabetes to liver failure or fatty liver disease. All of them share a common metabolic core. That's my mission.
And what is that common metabolic core?
Yeah, it's a little known problem called insulin resistance. In fact, when I first started this topic, I stumbled on one paper that documented how when fat tissue is growing, it increases the risk of type 2 diabetes. That was a concept in the early 2000s that was really getting a lot of attention. Diabesity, this kind of dual epidemic of wherever we see obesity, we see more type 2 diabetes. And this manuscript outlined something that was, to me, a revelation at the time. It was so fascinating, where when fat tissue is growing, it starts releasing pro-inflammatory proteins. That inflammation caused a problem called insulin resistance. And then that got me into this realm of understanding that other tissues of the body, as they become insulin resistant, then you start to spread the chronic disease. And essentially coming to the conclusion that something like hypertension, high blood pressure, which is the most common cardiovascular problem and the main contributor to heart disease. Well, insulin resistance is the main cause of hypertension. They call Alzheimer's disease type 3 diabetes, or more accurately, insulin resistance of the brain. Even the most common forms of infertility, in men, it's erectile dysfunction. Well, that's because of insulin resistance of the blood vessels. In women, the most common form of infertility is polycystic ovary syndrome, or PCOS. That's because of the insulin resistance affecting her ovaries and the ability to produce the proper sex hormones.
I guess the really important question here is, what is insulin resistance? And can you explain?
Insulin resistance it's a disorder that has two parts. It's like a coin with two sides, that as much as we think of one side just because we hear the word insulin resistance, but there's another part to it that is very important. So insulin, first of all, is a hormone that we make from the pancreas, a long kind of gland tucked underneath the stomach. And the pancreas is a very busy organ. It makes a lot of different hormones. It makes hormones that come into the blood. It also makes enzymes that go into the intestines to help digest food. But among the hormones that are being released into the blood is insulin. Now, in the person with type 1 diabetes, their immune system has destroyed their beta cells, so they don't make insulin anymore. That's why for a person with type 1 diabetes, insulin is a life-saving therapy. You're giving them what they're not making anymore. But for everybody else, we have beta cells, and they're releasing insulin when they need to. Now, usually the main reason the beta cell is releasing the insulin is because blood glucose levels go up.
So I eat sugar.
You eat sugar, or not even something as obvious as sugar, but bread or crackers.
White rice.
Chips. Oh, yes. So basically anything that falls into the family of a carbohydrate. So if the earth grows it, that's a carbohydrate. If it's a plant, it's a carbohydrate. Maybe that's a better way of describing it. And so it's going to have starches and sugars, which all kind of falls into this family of carbohydrate. Depending on how much starch or sugars that it has, then that will result in a bigger or smaller blood glucose or blood sugar response. But then if blood sugar is too high for too long, that becomes very harmful to the body. So insulin comes in and helps lower the blood glucose. And then having done its job, insulin comes back down.
So insulin comes out like a taxi and transports all the glucose in my blood to various places around the body to store them?
Perfect.
So
Yeah,
it's
and
like
the
a
main
taxi.
Yeah,
glucose.
that's right. You can look at it's a shuttle, it's a taxi saying, "Hey, glucose, come on in. I'm dropping you off at the muscle." So mostly, just as an interesting tangent of insulin, before I finish answering insulin resistance, insulin will open the doors for blood sugar to come in and drive the taxi in, mostly at the muscle and the fat. Muscle and fat tissue need insulin to come and bring the sugar in via taxi. However, other tissues, and the brain a little bit as well, other tissues will still respond to insulin, but they don't need insulin to tell it what to do with the sugar. It just takes it in. But even on those, like the liver, for example, if the liver sees sugar driving by in the taxi, it just opens the doors and lets it in. It doesn't need insulin to come and tell it to let the sugar in. However, even at the liver, and every other cell has a similar degree of this, the liver doesn't know what to do with it. So this is back to something I'd mentioned earlier, where insulin's thematic effect at the entire body is to tell the body what to do with energy in all of its forms as these kind of caloric-rich molecules, what to do with lactate, what to do with ketones, what to do with fats or glucose, what to do with amino acids. So insulin will tell the body what to do with all of those things. But again, its most famous effect is to control blood sugar. And that's not wrong, because its most powerful activator is blood sugar. So with all of that in mind, insulin resistance is two problems wrapped into one. The one problem is the most obvious one, which is that insulin isn't working as well as it used to. So back to the analogy of the taxis dropping off sugar, if the muscle tissue has become insulin resistant, insulin is coming and trying to pull the sugar-loaded taxi into the muscle, but the muscle's not listening.
So say that again. So the
Yeah.
insulin's coming past with the glucose inside it.
Well, not
Carrying
technically. Yeah, but just to sort of go with your metaphor, but maybe to use another one, insulin comes and knocks on the doors. It's like the bouncer
Yeah.
at the door. It's coming and knocking on the door of the muscle saying, "Hey, muscle, I've got some sugar that wants to come in."
Mhm.
And normally the muscle will say, "Oh yeah, sure, okay, open it up the doors and let the sugar come in." When the muscle is insulin resistant, the bouncer's knocking. Maybe there's even, I'm almost getting ahead of myself, but one bouncer, maybe two or three bouncers pounding on the doors of the muscle cell, but the muscle cell's not listening. It's become deaf. That's the insulin resistance of what we call insulin resistance, where some of insulin's effects, like helping lower blood sugar, it's not working very well anymore. And the muscle is just an obvious example because there's so much of it. You know, it is the biggest tissue on the average individual. Someone who's very obese perhaps now has more fat tissue, but even people who are overweight, most of us is muscle. So it's a good tissue to look at. So part of insulin resistance is that of all the things insulin is trying to do, including lower blood sugar, it doesn't do it quite as well as it used to. Some of the cells or tissues of the body have become deaf to insulin's demands. Now, however, at the same time that's happening, insulin levels are higher. And that is really important. And I'll mention an example in just a moment that highlights the difference between the two. But we have to consider, anytime we talk about insulin resistance, we think of two things happening in concert. One, insulin isn't working quite as well as it used to in various places of the body. At the same time, insulin levels are higher. And that kind of takes us back to the muscle cell, where I'd mentioned, getting a little ahead of myself, that a bouncer is knocking on the door, and once upon a time, the muscle cell would hear that one polite knock from that one bouncer, or one molecule of insulin, if you will, and it would open the door and let the glucose or the blood sugar come in. But now the muscle cell, the bouncer, insulin's knocking on the door, but the muscle doesn't listen. It's resistant. And so the body has adapted, and it learns, okay, well, if one bouncer wasn't enough, let's send an angry mob of bouncers. And then the muscle will start to open the door. And indeed it can. So those two problems go together. On one hand, insulin isn't working as well as it used to. That's what gives it the name insulin resistance. But there's another part that is equally present, which is that blood insulin levels are higher. Now, there's earlier at the outset of the conversation, I mentioned that even infertility has an origin, has some degree of development because of insulin resistance. And it's a perfect example of both of these parts of insulin resistance, where in some instances, insulin isn't working very well. Always with insulin resistance, blood insulin levels are higher. So, for example, erectile dysfunction is the most common form of male infertility. In fact, its connection to insulin resistance is so strong that just a few years ago, I was so struck by a title of a paper that had just been published, which stated something like, "Is erectile dysfunction the earliest manifestation of insulin resistance in otherwise young, healthy men?" Now, what is the connection? It's because in a normal erectile function, in order for the man to have normal erectile function, he has to experience a pretty dramatic increase in the size of the blood vessels in his body. The blood vessels expand, that increases blood flow, and then he has normal function. Part of that signal that tells the blood vessels that it's time to expand is actually insulin. And so this is what I said earlier, where insulin does so many things in the body, and we only think of it as being relevant to glucose, and that's not fair. Insulin does a lot of stuff, again, including telling blood vessels to expand. Now, unfortunately, in the case of this unfortunate man, his blood vessels become insulin resistant. So now it's insulin coming and knocking on the doors of the blood vessels saying, hey, it's time to expand and increase blood flow. But the blood vessels don't respond. They don't listen. So they stay constricted. Blood flow stays insufficient, and thus he has erectile dysfunction.
Look, I don't want to be insulin resistant.
No, no
So-
one does. No one does.
So tell me how it happens.
Yeah, right. Yeah. So the origins are so important because it helps us understand why we've gotten into the situation we are, where it's the most common problem worldwide. There are two pathways to insulin resistance. So two roads that get to the same destination. Again, the destination being insulin resistance. There's the fast lane, which I call fast insulin resistance, and it actually has 3 lanes, which I'll describe in a moment. Then there's the slow insulin resistance, which is it takes a little longer to get there, but at the same time, it takes a little longer to get away from it. So I'll start with fast insulin resistance because the slow one ends up getting a little excitingly complicated, but in a cool way. So with fast insulin resistance, there are 3 things that I could take you to a clinical lab and I could make you insulin resistant in 6 hours with either of these 3 things. But as quickly as it settles in, if I remove those things, your insulin resistance would go away. So these are fast causes and they're fast resolution. They are stress is a primary cause of fast insulin resistance. So too is inflammation. And then lastly, and this is going to sound somewhat paradoxical, too much insulin is also a cause. And I'll end with that one because I think it's the most important. Then transition to slow insulin resistance. So anytime the body is experiencing too much stress, it will very quickly become insulin resistant. Now, as a professor who teaches endocrinology, no surprise, I define stress in the context of hormones. And there are 2 primary stress hormones, cortisol and what we call in the US epinephrine, or in the UK adrenaline. Those are the 2 stress hormones. Now, those hormones are very distinct. They have almost nothing in common. But like when you are feeling a little stressed, it's both of those, especially adrenaline/epinephrine, that are making you feel a little jittery. It's making your heart beat a little faster. You're a little more alert. That all starts to play into a stress response. But what those 2 hormones have in common is that they both want blood glucose levels to climb. It's kind of their way of saying, hey, we don't really know what's going on right now, but we want to be ready to run away, that's the fight or flight kind of aspect to stress. And so they want to push blood glucose levels up, and they do very well. That, of course, puts them at odds with the hormone insulin, because these 2, epinephrine or adrenaline and cortisol, the 2 stress hormones, they're pushing glucose up. Insulin wants to push it down. So the more the body has those stress hormones elevated, because of, say, sleep deprivation, that's a very effective way to increase cortisol. Or they are drinking too much caffeine. That is a way to increase epinephrine quite strongly. If both of those signals are too incessant, or they continue to be present and climb, then insulin has to work harder and harder, and then we have insulin resistance. So stress is a cause of insulin resistance. But then next is inflammation. You and I were commenting about earlier about how, boy, there's a cold going around. People, it's flu season. Even then, if a person were wearing a continuous glucose monitor on the back of their arm, measuring their glucose levels, they would see their glucose levels are much, much higher, like significantly higher during the time that they're struggling with this infection. That is a reflection of insulin resistance. Insulin's having a harder time keeping the blood glucose levels in check. Anytime inflammation is up, insulin resistance will be up as well. Even in things like autoimmune diseases, there are reports in humans that document the degree to which someone has, say, active rheumatoid arthritis. Their joints are achy because of an autoimmune attacking of the joints. They will note on some days, like every autoimmune disease, there is an ebb and a flow. Some days it's good, some days it's bad. And on the bad days, if you measure their insulin resistance, it is absolutely locked with the degree to which their immune system is turned on or off, or higher or lower. So inflammation is another cause. And then the last one of the fast lane of insulin resistance is too much insulin itself. Now, the astute listener will realize the kind of circular thing I've just presented by invoking high insulin as a cause of insulin resistance, because they will also think, but wait a minute, Ben, you just said that high insulin is also a consequence of insulin resistance. That, back to the bouncer knocking on the door of the muscle cell, if one bouncer wasn't enough, or one molecule of insulin wasn't enough, the body will say, okay, well, let's send 10 molecules of insulin. So high insulin is both a consequence of insulin resistance, but it's also a cause. And this is reflective of a fundamental principle in all of biology, that if there is too much of a stimulus, a cell, if it's capable, will try to become resistant to that stimulus. This would be like a funny analogy of in the Bickman home. My darling wife is home with the children. That is what she wants to do. She is full-time mom. When I'm home, and I try to be home as much as I can, it's funny for me to note the difference in how quickly we each respond to our children. I will hear my child saying, "Mom, Mom, Mom," and she's not responding. Mom has heard this for so much that she's become kind of selectively deaf to when my children are demanding her attention. I'm not as around my children quite as much because I'm working during the day. And so when I hear that, it's a very fresh signal to me. I've not heard it so much that I've become deaf to it. And so I will respond even though I'm in the other room, because I'm so much more sensitive to the clamoring for attention. This is like the body in response to insulin. If there is always insulin, it's always going up, the body will start to say, the muscle cell will start to say, boy, insulin, you are knocking on my door all the time. This is getting old. I'm not responding anymore. I'm not going to listen as much as I was before. So in that sense, insulin, too much insulin becomes a cause of insulin resistance. And back to what I said earlier, I could take you into the lab, start infusing you with just a little drip of insulin to increase your insulin, and over just a few hours, you would become demonstrably less sensitive to it than you were before we started. But again, as I take that away, give your body a few hours and it's back to normal. In every one of those instances, it's a fast onset and it's also a fast solution if we can take it away.
If we can take it away, but if we can't take it away, does it become sort of chronic?
Yeah, so at that, especially, all of these can contribute to a more lingering insulin resistance, but especially insulin, where I focus on that one the most because of not only its relevance to the slow lane, but also just how present it is, where 70% of all calories globally are carbohydrates. And now, perhaps with the best of intentions, our experts are telling us that we should be eating 6 times a day. And so we wake up in the morning, insulin has finally been coming down while we've been fasting overnight. Insulin gets to take a little bit of a break. We're fasting. Then we break that fast by eating breakfast. And in the UK, as it is in the US, by and large, this is going to be a very starchy, sugary breakfast. It's toast with some jam, or it's cereal, or it's bagels. That is almost pure glucose. And so what do? We wake up, we eat breakfast, we spike our blood sugar levels, and insulin has to come up. Insulin will take longer to come down than the blood sugar will. it will wait in the blood to make sure that all the blood sugar has gone back to normal. So depending on how much carbohydrate we ate for breakfast, it could take our insulin levels 3 or even 4 hours to come back down to normal. Long before it's had a chance to come back down to normal, we've had a mid-morning snack, of course. We need to go get a sugary coffee and another bagel or something. And so after just a couple hours, we do it again. And once again, before insulin has had a chance to come back down, we have a starchy, carbohydrate-heavy lunch, then an afternoon snack, and then a carbohydrate-heavy dinner. And then, of course, we have to have an evening snack before we go to bed. So the average individual is spending every waking moment in a state of elevated insulin. And thus, the signal never really goes away because they never give themselves a break. But one of the consequences of that I mentioned, which is that it directly causes insulin resistance. But when insulin is high, it starts to have a signal on the fat cell. And that then brings us to the slow insulin resistance, where you have something happening in the fat tissue that begins to set the stage for insulin resistance in the entire body. And it takes longer to settle in, but it takes also longer to go away. That's why I call this one slow insulin resistance. Now, in the case of insulin, most people, so the key with I'll explain it this way first. So the most relevant feature with fat tissue contributing to insulin resistance is the size of each fat cell. When we typically think of fat, we would maybe say, okay, Steve has, I'll do this in kilos for the UK audience. Steve has 10 kilos of fat on your entire body. That's probably too much for you. Ben has 20 kilos. And yet, it's possible that I'm healthier metabolically than you. And that's because it's not the mass of fat that matters most. It's the size of the fat cell that matters. This is why women, despite universally being fatter than her male counterparts, are healthier with regards to insulin resistance and every single metabolic problem. It's because women, as a result of her particular sex hormones, have more fat cells, but they're smaller. So she has more fat, but smaller fat cells. And small fat cells are healthy, insulin-sensitive, anti-inflammatory fat cells. But the bigger the fat cell gets, the more it initiates a cascade of events or a series of events that creates insulin resistance.
And am I right in thinking we have the same amount of fat cells for our whole life pretty much?
That's a really, really safe assumption for most people. Yeah, for most people, a fat cell, sometimes students will hear that fat cells are immortal. That is not true. But they're long-lived. Fat cells will live about 10 years. And so typically, by the time, if you look at a newborn, during infancy, childhood, and puberty, the number of fat cells is going up, 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 up. Once they finish puberty, so mid to late teens for a young woman, late teens or even early 20s for a young man, usually at that point, the number of fat cells they have is going to be very static.
This is something people don't really understand, and I actually discovered it from doing this podcast and speaking to so many experts about this, that we pretty much, especially as an adult, have the same amount of fat cells, really regardless of what we eat.
Yes.
And it's actually just the fat cells we have shrinking
or growing,
or expanding.
Exactly. That's exactly right. Now, there are differences across...
Which, by the way, makes liposuction a pretty fucking bad idea.
In fact, it makes things worse. Please, let's make sure we come back to that.
Okay, I'll write down liposuction.
Because it really becomes, the person ends up, their vanity ends up really ruining their future metabolic outcomes. But there are differences across ethnicity. Like, this is a little oversimplified, but not much. On one end, you'd have Caucasians, kind of Northern European Caucasians. On the other end, you'd have East Asians, like Chinese, Japanese, Korean, East Asians. And then if you look at that same spectrum of people making fat cells through their life, an East Asian will be making fat cells and then stop right about here. So very few fat cells, relatively speaking, across all the ethnicities. They have very few fat cells. A Caucasian on the other end of the spectrum, they went way higher. And so this guy, let's say American Ben versus Chinese Ben, overly simplified, but here we are. So much of fat mass isn't the number of fat cells, even though American Ben has more, it's the size of the fat cell. So I could be the same percent body fat really as Chinese Ben, but that would just be because my fat cells were just that much smaller. But this is the problem then. If you have, let's say, American Ben and Chinese Ben both gained 10 kilos of pure fat over the next 10 years. Very easily done. Most people do that quite often. Caucasian Ben just doesn't look as good in his Speedo, which as a pasty Caucasian, he's not going to look particularly good in that Speedo anyway. But I just am bulging a little more than I was before. But otherwise, I'm healthy. My blood pressure's fine. My blood sugar's fine. Everything's normal. Put that same 10 kilos of fat on Chinese Ben, hypertension, type 2 diabetes, fatty liver disease, infertility. And that is because Chinese Ben had fewer fat cells to start with. And so those fat cells, as the body was told to store fat, those fat cells were getting much, much bigger, much sooner. And the fat cell promotes insulin resistance very, very readily. And so that logically moves into the question of, well, what makes fat cells grow? And it is two essential variables that we only ever look at calories. And yet, if you take a person with type 1 diabetes and say, I want you to eat 10,000 calories, but don't give yourself your insulin injection, they cannot gain weight. It is literally impossible for the type 1 diabetic to get fat if they are skipping their insulin injections. In fact, this is so known that if you take, let's imagine a young woman who would maybe have more pressure to be thin than her male counterpart, although it's happening more in males too. Imagine a young girl who gets diagnosed with type 1 diabetes at the age of 13 or 14. Very impressionable time. She's very worried about how she looks and how thin she is. She learns that, wait a minute, I can eat whatever I want, and all I have to do is not inject my insulin, and I'll be as skinny as I want. And it works. It works so well that it's actually a formal eating disorder called diabulimia. So the fact that this exists is absolute proof that the growing and the shrinking of the fat cell is more complicated than just calories being high or low. Because like I'd said earlier, when I talked about hormones, hormones are a way for the very tissues of the body to know what it ought to do with energy. And so a fat cell will have energy all around it. And if it doesn't have insulin to tell it what to do, it won't do anything with it. Or maybe to make this more direct, back home in my lab, my students are growing fat cells in Petri dishes. These fat cells are swimming in a little sea of calories, lots of glucose, lots of fats, and yet they stay really small until we add insulin. The moment we add insulin into that little Petri dish, if we check those cells 4 hours later, they're immediately fatter. If we check them 4 hours later, they're fatter still. Now they know what to do with the energy they have. So with slow insulin resistance, it develops when fat cells get really, really big. It's like because they have to tell insulin, you are telling me to keep growing. I can't keep growing. I'm so big that I'm going to pop. I mean, literally, the fat cell can get so big that it degrades its membrane. It's like a water balloon that a naughty little boy has overfilled and it's about to burst. The fat cell doesn't want to burst. And so it tells insulin, you are trying to make me grow. You're telling me to grow. I can't listen anymore. I'm becoming insulin resistant to stop growing.
So insulin makes you fat?
Oh, very much. Now, a moment ago I said that the big fat cell is two variables. You must have both. You must have both a signal to tell the fat cell to get big, which is insulin. There's no other signal that can do it. You can, in a human, just simply take away the insulin, like type 1 diabetes. It doesn't matter any other hormone in the body. It does not matter. They cannot get fat. They can eat 10,000 calories of chocolate cake. They cannot get fat. Not only can they not get fat, they can't hold on to their fat. Because if there's no insulin to tell the fat cell to hold on to it or get big, it has to shrink. It's breaking down its fat. So the body goes into such a dramatic fat-burning state in the absence of insulin that keeping fat becomes impossible. So the insulin signal is necessary to tell the fat cell what to do. But the fat cell will say, okay, insulin, you're high, you're telling me to grow, but what am I going to grow with? That's where the calories come in. Now the fat cell will say, hey, fats and glucose in the blood, insulin has told me to get big, and so I need to pull you in to help me grow. You're going to give me the bulk. And if you have one without the other, it is death.
So if I'm eating 2,000 calories and I have a different insulin sensitivity to you, say we both eat 2,000 calories and I'm insulin resistant, Doesn't that mean that I will?
You'll store more as fat.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. Yeah. So your body, now it would partly depend on, there are people where if all of your fat cells had reached its maximum point, then you're done. You're not going to gain more fat. You're just
Sure.
going to become more and more and more insulin resistant.
Okay, fine.
So you kind of start limiting yourself. But there are studies in humans to show that if you give humans isocaloric meals, so the exact same number of calories, but they in the same amount of protein, but you differ those meals based on the amount of carbs to the amount of fat. So let's say 2 meals, exact same calories, 2,000 calories, or that's in one meal, that's too high, 1,000 calories in one meal. One version of this is the conventional way of eating, which is lower fat, higher carb. The other meal, same number of calories, but it's lower carb, higher fat. This lower carb, higher fat version will have a lower insulin response, and they will store less fat from that meal. And someone would say, well, where do the calories go? You can't, it's the laws of thermodynamics. You can't destroy energy. The metabolic rate will go up. So when insulin is low, if you have someone going a full day eating the same number of calories but lower carb calories, their metabolic rate will be almost 300 calories higher in that day.
And metabolic rate is the...
Yeah, that's the total amount of energy that it just costs you and I to just live.
Okay, so...
We're just going through the day. But that's a significant amount. Like if you and I were to go exercise and say, let's go burn 300 calories, we got to be on the stair stepper for an hour or something. So it's 300 calories. But at the same time, if your insulin is low, you're burning so much fat that you start making ketones. And I don't intend to get onto that topic quite yet, but suffice it to say, every molecule of a ketone has a caloric load roughly similar to glucose. And what the body, when it starts making a lot of ketones, it starts eliminating the ketones. So every time someone is breathing out ketones, they're literally breathing out calories. Or they're urinating, and they're urinating out ketones if they have higher ketones in their blood. They're urinating out calories because ketones have energy. And so this is the way that if insulin is low, it becomes impossible for the body to hold on to its energy. It is so determined to spend energy that it will both increase metabolic rate, and it will make the calories be wasted in the breath and in the urine and in the form of ketones, because ketones have calories. Ketones are energy. Now we're just dumping them out into the universe.
It's worth, before we talk about how to keep my insulin levels low so that I can benefit from all the health benefits we've talked about, it's probably also worth just spending a little bit of time trying to understand the evolutionary basis of insulin resistance.
There are some theories that are very interesting that attempt to explain why is it that we became so fantastically different from, let's say, our closest animal relatives, other primates like chimpanzees or apes. What was the difference that had us become so different than them? One of the leading theories is a theory called the expensive tissue hypothesis. And it actually does have something to do with ketones. In the expensive tissue hypothesis, as the theory goes, our earlier ancestors deviated in this kind of animal family line because we started eating more meat. We started eating food that was so nutritious, so nutrient dense, so loaded with good calories and all of the fats and proteins that we need, that it allowed two very distinct changes to occur in us compared to other primates. One, our intestines became significantly shorter. So if you compare the human digestive tract to any other primate animal, if we are a primate, then if you look at the intestines, they're fantastically different, particularly the large intestine or the colon, because our ancestors, as the theory goes, began eating meat. We didn't need the colon as much because the colon is a place for food to ferment. And so if you're eating a lot of plant matter, like other primates do, you need a much, much larger colon. So we started eating food that was so nutrient dense, our colon shrunk considerably. We didn't need to waste energy on a big, busy colon. At the same time, as we were eating food that was so nutrient dense and so loaded with good fat, it allowed us to have more time to be curious and explore. And so at the same time, our intestines were shrinking because we didn't need them to be so big. Our brain was growing. And it's because it had so much nutrition, including ketones. So ketones are an extraordinary fuel for the brain. In fact, one of the reasons why a baby that is born premature will be more likely to have learning disorders later in life is because premature baby didn't have time to get very fat. And fat baby is healthy baby. And fat baby gets into ketosis. Let's say you and I were to fast straight for 2 days. If you took a 6-month-old baby, that baby would be in a deeper state of ketosis in 2 hours than you and I would be in 2 days. Because the baby is burning so much of its beautiful chubby fat. And the more the body burns fat, the more it makes ketones. And the tissue of the body that appears to benefit the most in response to ketones is the brain. The brain, the moment ketones hit the blood stream, the brain immediately starts taking in ketones for a fuel. Very often, I have students who have had a professor, perhaps with the best of intentions, but ignorant nonetheless, tell the student that the main fuel for the brain is glucose, that the brain prefers glucose. And I show them just 1 or 2 papers to prove that wrong immediately. And it is reflected in this idea, which if to use some convenient UK units, if blood glucose is 5 millimolar, that's a concentration, a way of measuring an amount of something. Blood glucose may be 5 millimolar or 80 milligrams per deciliter for the American audience. That would be a normal glucose. And if you and I were to fast for 24 or so hours, we may get up to about 1 millimolar of ketones. And yet, even then, the brain has already switched to get the majority of its energy from the ketone. And so don't tell me that in this dynamic, the brain prefers this one, because this one's 5 times higher than this one. And even in that scenario, the brain is already getting more than half of its energy from the ketone. So all of this is my long-winded way of saying, when we look at the principles of evolution, one of the leading theories is this idea that we began eating essentially a meat-heavy diet that, again, is so nutritious that it allowed our brains to grow. Maybe one final point on this, although it is a bit of a barbed comment, people may find this somewhat amusing or disappointing or frustrating. The title of a book just published, which is that vegetarians have smaller brains. This is seen in humans, that the less a human eats meat, then the smaller the brain becomes. The brain is so dependent on the nutrient density that comes from animal-sourced foods that it will suffer when it doesn't get them.
Interesting. I mean, that's a controversial thing to say.
It is, and you can cut it out. But it really is, it's a real thing. And why does depression go up so much when people stop eating animal-sourced foods? It's because you are depriving the brain of what it needs.
What is it exactly you're depriving the brain of in that situation?
Yeah. So at least, among other things, at least it would be the essential omega-3 fats. So there are 3 omega-3s, and humans can only get 1 from plants, but it's one that the humans don't use. We need the other 2, and they only come from animal source foods.
And you could supplement.
Absolutely.
Right. And that would...
Yeah, you can. But so the solution in that regard is the vegan must be educated enough to know what they're deficient in, and then wealthy enough to afford the supplements to make up for it.
So is that the only evolutionary sort of hypothesis towards why we develop this insulin resistance?
Oh, yeah. In fact, it's funny that you bring the question up again, because I realized I didn't quite answer it that way. So insulin resistance, why would it exist at all? It would probably be a way for the body to know when it was needed to hold on to energy a little better. So now, I say that now, and someone would think, well, but why would I want to hold on to energy in a way where it's causing hypertension and Alzheimer's disease and increasing the risk of heart disease? Not all versions of insulin resistance are negative. So there is what all the insulin resistance that you and I have been talking about is pathological insulin resistance or harmful insulin resistance. Insulin resistance that serves no good purpose and it's making us sick. However, there is insulin resistance in human development, which is physiological or helpful. It's supposed to happen. And that is the 2 P's of physiological insulin resistance: puberty and pregnancy. Because in both of those instances, as we outlined earlier, when the body's insulin resistant, insulin is high. That's not always bad, because insulin wants things to grow. It is like a fertilizer in the body. Now, sometimes it's misplaced and results in problems like increasing the risk of cancer, for example. But in other instances, if you have a young child who needs some explosive growth during puberty, well, then that's really helpful. Insulin's telling the body to store more energy, to build up tissues, including muscle and bone, but also including fat.
So in pregnancy, insulin's playing a role in growing the
It
placenta,
sure is.
the breasts.
Yeah, so in the woman, after she's finished puberty, the only other time of growth she'll ever have will be pregnancy. And so those are the two instances where the body has become insulin resistant to take advantage of the heightened scenario where it can grow.
Because the woman's body needs more
Oh,
fat. Right?
goodness, yes. Yes, so her body not only needs to grow tissue mass, like the uterus has to get much bigger, she has to grow a placenta. She also needs to become a little insulin resistant to give a little more glucose to her baby, because she is, after all, now living for two people. And so as her body becomes insulin resistant, it actually facilitates the growth of the baby a little more rapidly. But as you noted, it helps her store more fat. And progesterone is another hormone that even accelerates that process. But basically, it's her body's way of saying, hey, I am committing to growing another human, and it's going to be metabolically very demanding. And so I'm going to have as much extra fat or as much extra energy as I can in order to ensure that if there's any sort of scarcity in food that happens during the course of the pregnancy, I'll have enough energy to get through it all. And then maybe I'll even have enough to continue to feed the baby with lactation after the baby's born.